for inviting me. This is going to be fun for everybody except maybe one person here. So you might wonder, what is the connection between the Beatles and the race to the moon? Well, my premise is that these two adventures, because they were both adventures, a technological adventure and a musical adventure, were the DNA of the 1960s. Two threads continuously intertwined from 1960 to 1970, because yes, very conveniently, both adventures start around 1960 and were over by January 1st, 1970. This is a picture from the famous photographer Richard Avedon, taken around 1965. So what is it? Paul McCartney of the Beatles in a NASA spacesuit. The perfect embodiment of those two topics. It was only the middle of the decade when he took that picture, but it was already clear that these were the two of the dominant themes of that decade. It's incredible to think this far out that everybody in this picture in the 1960s was known to the American public on a first-name basis. Right? So all the guys on the top there, Alan, Deke, you name it, John, all these guys were our Mercury 7 astronauts. These were our knights in shining armor, and of course you had John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He was also known on a first-name basis. He was with the enemy. This was the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. Every American knew who Yuri Gagarin was. And even though he was the enemy, they had to begrudgingly give him some respect. I think of him as being to the Americans what Derek Jeter might be to a Red Sox fan. And if you read a magazine, it's hard to imagine, but it seems as though the space race and the Beatles were in every other magazine issue. It would be as if you had People magazine and Newsweek and Time, and in any given week, there would be something on the space race or on the Beatles. So, of course, in a space magazine, you would expect something like this. But also in a magazine that was a more general magazine, Life magazine, of course. These are, again, our Mercury 7 astronauts. Time magazine, von Braun, who created those missiles that went to the moon. In France, the Russian cosmonauts. And then, of course, finally the moon landing. And then, of course, the Beatles, too. So there are many, many amazing things about the Beatles. We're not going to cover those, but just to bring home a certain point, one of the incredible things was the volume of quality songs that they released in a relatively short period of time. They first recorded in '62, just one song. Most of their recordings started in 1963, and their last recordings were in 1969. And not only were there recordings, but in the middle of all that, there were 4 movies. So this was 1963, 1964 in America. Not a bad start. And then 64, 65, a pretty good year. 66, not bad. Now 67 would be a career year for any band. If any musical act just came out with this for their entire career, they would be one of the most well-known musical acts in the world. But that was just 1 year in the career of the Beatles. And they offered all different styles of music. So it was like going to a banquet where you had peanut butter and jelly and stuff and macaroni and cheese for the kids. And then you had more sophisticated music, and then you had the psychedelic stuff. So no matter what your musical tastes were, there was something in there for you. And always A-plus level material. 1968, you're going to recognize some of these songs. And then they finished off with this. Okay? A nice little career. And the Beatles are still with us. If you know their songs, you see them everywhere. It's a little bit fun because you see something in a newspaper, in a magazine, you go, aha, I know what they're trying to do here. But of course, if you don't know their songs, it goes right over. So you can go out right now and buy Strawberry Fields cereal. Get Back is a song that comes up rather frequently, either that or in classical music, you Get By. So keep an eye out for that and you'll see it a lot. See at the top there? Okay, Here Comes the Sun is a very frequent one. I'm just giving you a very quick sample. With a little help from my friends, written by the wife of the former president of France. With a little help from my friends. The revolution shows up a lot. You say you want a revolution? There you go. Lonely Hearts Club. Sports Illustrated, right? All you need is love. Okay, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is popular. Planet in the Sky, Carrie in the Sky, Lucy in the Sky with Therapist, Apple in the Sky with Diamonds, Planets in the Sky with Diamonds. Somebody wrote a book. Back in the USSR. See this ad last summer? All together now. Now you really have to know your Beatles to know that's a Beatles song. But you'll notice how they put a dot after each word. And I have to worry about copyright infringement. Otherwise, why would they put a period after each word? Okay, maybe you can hack my car. Can't buy me love. Oh, that's great in all sorts of different psychology, politics, more politics. Here, there, and everywhere. Here, there, and everywhere. Here, there, and everywhere. Cover of Time magazine. You notice it? Down here, a day in the life. Okay, what's the first line of a day in the life? I read the news today, oh boy. So they won't say a day in the life necessarily like this, but they'll say, I read the news today. I read the news today, oh boy. I read the news today, oh boy. All right, so what I'd like to do is, I have a number of stories, little vignettes. I like stories that have a story behind the story. And it's a mixture of Beatles and space stories. And there are too many for just this presentation. I'm going to skip over them. I'll give you a little taste of what they are. And then if there's time, I can always go back to the ones that I didn't discuss in detail. So the first one I'm going to skip. How many of you saw the movie or read the book, The Right Stuff? Okay, so maybe you know what happens to Gus Grissom. He's the second man in space, and his space flight went beautifully. And then what happened when he splashed down? The hatch to the capsule opened and started to sink, and he jumped out, and he nearly drowned. So that's a fascinating story. This was his little rocket. You know, in the early days it was just pencil thin, and there was there's the Liberty Bell at the bottom of the ocean, and there it is on the right, restored. You can go see it in Kansas. So this is a great story. And sometimes in retrospect, you think to yourself, what were these people thinking? It's so obvious. You know, it's when you know what happens afterward, you just can't believe what happened initially. So the Beatles recorded on Capitol Records in America. And this was a sister company to Parlophone in Great Britain, which is really where they recorded. Capitol had no interest in the Beatles initially. The Beatles released their first #1 hit, Please Please Me. And Alan Livingston, president of Capitol Records, said, no thank you, we'll pass. The Beatles released their second #1 hit in the same year, From Me to You. Alan Livingston said, sorry, we're not interested in the United States. The Beatles had their third #1 hit of the year, She Loves You, a monster hit throughout Europe. They were now enormous celebrities crisscrossing Europe. Alan Livingston said, we're not interested in America. No one's going to like this in the United States. So finally, they recorded their fourth #1 single. I mean, just imagine they had 4 #1 singles in 1 year. They released their fourth #1 single. Alan Livingston's still not really interested. The fact is, Capitol Records in the United States hadn't done so well with rock and roll, and they had just signed another rock and roll band from their backyard in California with another band that started with BEA. Anybody know? What other band started with BEA?
Beach Boys.
The Beach Boys, exactly. So Alan Livingston figured he had enough rock and roll with the Beach Boys. And he hated the look of the Beatles. Everybody thought they looked like the Three Stooges with their ridiculously long hair. And he hated their name, which was disgusting. And he hated their sound. You know, and he would say, you know, who leaps 1 octave when you say, I want to hold your hands? Who sings like that? Not Frank Sinatra, not Barbra Streisand. It was a ridiculous sound. But it was the first song ever in Great Britain to sell 1 million copies even before it had been released. People bought the record, and they didn't care what it sounded like. And that had only happened once in the United States when Elvis Presley released Hound Dog. So that was a pretty impressive feat. Even Alan Livingston had to recognize that that was impressive. And you can see in a market 1/3 the size of the United States, the Beatles already had as many million-dollar sellers as the entire American industry. He just could not ignore that. And Ed Sullivan had just signed them to a show on February 9th, 1964. So in January 1964, Alan Livingston finally relented. He said, okay, fine, we'll take it. And the rest is history. But it's hard to imagine that Alan Livingston and Capitol Records would have been so resistant. So the Beatles had, by the standards of the day, ridiculously long hair, which all the guys wanted to imitate, obviously. So talk about, you can like the Beatles music, or maybe you don't like the Beatles music, but you can't deny their impact on society. So as a result of their long hair, a number of barbershops closed. It was devastating to that industry. By the end of the 1960s, what percentage of barbershops do you think closed? 5%? Let's say the multiple choice question. 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%? What do you guys say? 20? 15? 30. Okay, well, I'm sorry. This was a trick question. So, talk about a musical act having an impact on society. So you might like the Rolling Stones, or you might like Nirvana, or Justin Timberlake, or Beyonce, whatever. These are all, wonderful acts, but to have an impact like that on society. Oh, Dad. Because everybody suddenly wanted to look like this, or like that, or like that. Or like that.
Dude, that looks exactly like you.
Wait, is that him? Oh, that's great.
This is another great story.
You should go your hair out like that.
So you would think that, considering their enormous popularity, that the critics would have just lapped up the music of the Beatles. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. When the Beatles came out, this is what the New York Times had to say. Newsweek. The home of rock and roll. Not yet the home of rock and roll. Then, as soon as the movie was released, the critics loved it. They thought it was a great movie. And every review started apologetic, just like this. So help me, I resisted. The Village Voice. The same New York Times. This is going to surprise you. Newsweek. Completely different tune. And finally, the New York Times. So, a space story. Ed White has a problem. Ed White was the first American to walk in space. He didn't actually walk, he sort of floated, but still, it was a remarkable milestone. If man was going to go to the moon, he had to be able to survive the rigors of space. So this was an opportunity to test a spacesuit. Now, the technology that goes into a spacesuit is a lecture onto itself. But this was the first test of it. And the flight was a remarkable success until what happened? He couldn't get back into the space capsule. Any idea why? And no one at NASA had ever predicted this. His suit had inflated a fraction of an inch as a result of the vacuum of space. And that expansion of his suit made it impossible for him to get back into the space capsule. The hatch was too narrow. So everybody at NASA huddled. They had no idea. They had not anticipated this problem. Ed White was going to die. So McDivitt, his buddy, was working frantically to help him get back in. But he was probably under orders to cut the umbilical cord and let Ed White just float away and die. He would have been the first guy in space. The spacesuit worked fine, but too bad. So what do you think Ed White did? What would you do? Put a hole in it. Okay, well, have you ever put a pin in a balloon? Does it slowly? But you know what? That's pretty much what he did. Because out of desperation, because he was going to die anyway, he opened the valve and he shut it, just for a fraction of a moment. And that was enough. That allowed him to get back in. And NASA never reported this to the world. And the press in those days was very nice about not reporting things that NASA didn't want to report. And as far as the world knew, it was a fantastic success. And of course it was. The spacesuit worked. Now here's the story behind the story. Ed White was not the first human in space. He was only the first American in space. Alexei Leonov was the first human in space. This was at a time when the Russians were still beating us at every step of the way. Now what's interesting is Alexei Leonov's spacewalk was a tremendous success until what happened?
He couldn't get back in.
His spacesuit inflated by a fraction of an inch. He couldn't get back in. And they said to him from Moscow, wherever the heck they were, I'm sorry, you're on your own. And so what did he do? Open the valve and shut it. Now you might think, how stupid could the people at NASA be? I mean, they see what happened to Leonov. Could they not think that this would also happen to Ed White? Why do you think that? What could have happened? It wasn't just a space race, it was a space war. And the Russians weren't about to tell anybody that anything had gone wrong, let alone have they fixed it. We're going to skip this. I'm glad to come back. I'm going to have Pete on the instrument now. Pass on Chase Stadium. Now, this is a great story.
This is an
This
awesome
is what's
story.
great about collecting stuff. This is just a ticket to a concert. And there's a great story behind this, September what, 17th, 1964 Kansas City concert. So the first time the Beatles toured America, in the summer and fall of 64, they were crisscrossing the country in very random fashion. And they had just one day off in the middle. And Charles O. Finley, the owner of the then Kansas City Athletics, the A's, wanted the Beatles to play in Kansas City on their day off. So the Beatles said, no, we'll play the next time you come over. And he said, no, I want you this time. And they said, no, we only have one day off. And he said, I'll offer you, in dollars from 1964, I'll offer you $1 million just to play one night. No, I'll offer you $2 million, $3 million, $5 million. Finally, he offered them more money than Frank Sinatra or Barbra Streisand had ever received. And they said yes. So that, Charles Finley said, and by the way, for the money I'm paying, could you play the song Kansas City? It was a 50s song Elvis had sung it. The Beatles knew it backwards and forwards. It had been part of their repertoire before they were famous. There would have been nothing for them to do. And they said, basically, you bought our day off, you're not buying our song sync. He said, oh, come on, I'll give you another $1 million. So, oh, come on, I'll give you $2 million. One song, it'll take you 1 minute and 30 seconds. No. And finally, he realized they weren't going to do it. So the day of the concert comes, and they play their set, and they take their bow. And then John Lennon looks into the owner's box, and he goes, and for the fans, we'd like to play one more song. And Paul McCartney goes, Kansas City. And they played the song. They weren't going to play it for him, they were going to play it for the fans. I think that's sort of a cool story. It gives you an idea of the personalities working. So we're going to skip the story, but Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, nearly didn't survive his first trip in space. His job was to connect his Gemini capsule with this Agena rocket, and nobody had ever, no astronaut had ever managed to dock two spacecraft together. And that was obviously going to be critical to any moon mission. And he was successful, but then the capsule started to spin out of control, and he nearly died. But as we know, he survived. So that's a story for another day. We'll skip yesterday. We'll skip Buzz Aldrin. Very interesting story about how life doesn't always turn out the way you think it will. Maybe we'll get back to that, because it's a great story. We'll skip these weirdos. We'll skip tragedy. We'll skip India. We'll go back to that. And I want to talk a little bit about Apollo 8. The Apollo 8 astronauts aren't as famous as the Apollo 11 astronauts, but in my mind, what they did was just as incredible. These were the first guys to go to the moon. They didn't land on the moon. They went to the moon, around the moon, and came back. These were the first astronauts to fly off into deep space. Now, it was remarkable in more ways than one. First of all, you have to appreciate the physics of it. The football analogy would be the ultimate quarterback bomb. So for any of you who have any passing knowledge of football, the quarterback doesn't throw the ball to where the receiver is. He throws the ball to where he knows or thinks or hopes the receiver is going to be when the ball lands. So when the astronauts took off, the moon was here. But 3.5 days later, the moon was going to be here. So they take off in space, and they're aiming for an empty spot. Now, it's even more complicated, because they weren't trying to aim for the moon, because otherwise they would have landed and arrived like manicotti. They would have crashed right onto the surface of the moon. What they were trying to do is they were trying to arrive 60 miles in front of the moon, right there, so as to be caught by lunar gravity and go into lunar orbit. So what happened if they got there an hour too soon? They would be around Pluto around now. And what if they got there an hour late? And splat, they would have landed and crash landed right on the moon. So just getting there was a great feat. But the other thing is, what did they see when they looked back? They were going to the moon. What did they see that no one had ever seen before when they looked behind them?
The surface of the Earth.
They saw the Earth. No one had ever seen the entire planet. It was an incredible sight. They hadn't planned for that. And they needed permission to take the picture. Because NASA had counted every single, this wasn't the days of digital where you could take 5,000 pictures. They had rolls of film. And every picture was accounted for. They were going to take this picture at this point, and this picture at this point, and this picture at this point. They were supposed to take pictures of the lunar surface to prepare for a future lunar landing. They look back, they see the Earth, they go, oh my God, this was the first time anybody could appreciate how small, how beautiful, how iridescent, how fragile the Earth was in this vast emptiness. You can see the quote from Andrews, who took the picture. We went to explore the moon, and we discovered the Earth. And then when they came around the moon, they saw the famous Earthrise, which is this famous picture. 100 photographs that changed the world. This just came out last year. 100 photographs that changed the world. And which one did they choose to put on the cover? I mean, this, you could argue all day long as to what the most important or what the most famous picture is in the world. You've got a lot to choose from. But this would have to be on anybody's list of top 5. The story behind the story is that the picture wasn't taken that way. picture was taken this way. This is from the original negative. You see how the horizon is vertical. They were coming around the moon this way, not that way. And so the Earth appeared along the side. There's a little controversy about that. But the story goes that NASA turned the picture around so that it would look like an Earthrise, which would make for a better story. So the only astronaut I've ever spoken to was Bill Anders, the guy who took that picture. So I said to him, is the story true that NASA turned the picture over? And he said to me, let me put it to you this way, Ron. In my living room, I have it like this. Now, we're going to skip this story. I think we may have time to come to revisit it. I think, is it 10 to 11, to 1? I think we're good. So maybe I'll tell you the story. So, we all know Neil Armstrong was the first guy to land on the moon. What you don't know, he was really the first guy to die on the moon. Because they only had enough fuel to reach their targeted site. Because fuel is heavy, and every fraction of an ounce made a huge difference. So they just had enough fuel to land where they were supposed to, not to go wandering around. But what happened when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin arrived over their landing site? What did they see? They saw boulders. They weren't where they were supposed to be. There had been a little glitch an hour or so earlier when they separated from the command module, and they were a mile downfield. So instead of being over a nice flat area, they were over boulders. And the gas needle was on empty. Now, you know, I don't know if you've ever been in a car where the needle's on empty. I mean, I haven't been, but the fact of the matter is you don't know exactly how much fuel you have left. But it's not a good feeling. Well, his fuel gauge was on empty, and he was hovering over boulders. So he had permission to abort the mission. He could have just pushed the button, and the other rocket, the one that was supposed to send him back up, would have just sent him back, and that would have been the end of the mission. But instead, Neil Armstrong, as we know, toughed it out, and he found a spot to land. But what if he had landed on the boulders? He would have been able to get out. He and Buzz Aldrin would have been able to walk around. But they might not have been able to get back onto their lunar module. And they would have never been able to take off because they would have been at a crazy angle. Or they would have taken off and crashed. They would have never been able to get back to the command line. So, yes, he was the first to land on the moon and walk in the moon, but he came this close to never making it back. So, I want to finish a little bit with this. What makes this picture so famous? You recognize this probably as being the cover of the Beatles' last recorded album. Not the last one released, but the last recorded, Abbey Road. And you see this picture copied in many, many different ways. I was skiing in Utah, and this is what the snowbird decal looks like. I was in Philadelphia, a museum. Okay? So some of you probably have been to that. Anyway, so you see that picture everywhere, but it's just four guys crossing the street. So why would this picture become iconic? You see, this is why you take music appreciation and art appreciation classes. Because sometimes you like a piece of music or you like a piece of art, but you can't articulate what it is that you like about it. So what is it about this that makes this special? Yeah?
There was never really a picture ever taken before, like, with such symmetry. So, like, everyone, like, all four of them are in, like, a stride.
Right?
All pretty much the same.
Right. So there's a lot of symmetry here, and let me show you some outtakes. They didn't take this picture because the photographer was on a ladder taking pictures, and they have a motor drive, so it's click, 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 click. So the Beatles were walking back and forth, and he took 100 pictures, and one of them stood out. So they didn't take this one, and they didn't take that one. And they didn't take this one either. They picked that one. And you're absolutely right. You'll notice that all 8 legs are perfectly straight. Just a coincidence. Now, outside of a parade, the odds of 4 people walking and all 8 legs being in the heel strike phase of gait is very unusual. So it wasn't hard for the Beatles to say, you know what, we're going to take that picture. And I think that's what makes this picture iconic. So that's my last slide. You're welcome to look at more of this on Facebook or on the website. And if you have any questions, it's 5 minutes to 1. I can run back through some of those stories. I didn't want to take up too much of your time.